Friends, let us go to God in an attitude of prayer. Gracious and loving God, may the words of my mouth and the meditations of all our hearts be pleasing unto you, for you are this community's rock and redeemer. Amen. There's a question that many of us are left with after we've heard the parable of the Good Samaritan. And that question that kind of rolls around in my head, and maybe yours, hopefully yours as well, is, well, what would you do? What would I do? What would we do? That question is a question that haunts me most times because there's really no way of knowing what you might do in any given situation, especially one where the stakes are so high, as in the story of the Good Samaritan. Many people, myself included, have come to the story, the parable of the Good Samaritan, and boiled it down to that question. Heard this story, and then simply been left wondering, well, what would I do? Many people hear this story and ask that question, what would you do if you saw a man who had been beaten and left to die, just lying in a ditch? Would you be his neighbor? Or would you be like the priest and the Levite and cross to the other side of the road and keep going, avoiding the man at all cost? This parable has often been boiled down to this simple question, what would you do? It's been boiled down in this regard then to just a simple moral story. Are you going to help that hurting person? Or are you going to walk by? Becomes a simple story, a simple moral story. But this story is not so simple. This story is made complicated by fear. The person who ends up being the injured man's neighbor, the person who ends up being the good guy in this story, is not the one anyone would have expected, much less the original and first-time hearers of this parable. It's not the priest, it's not the Levite, it's not even a good Jewish person that comes and takes care of the injured and dying man. It's a Samaritan. Now, this seems like a small detail for us today, maybe a detail that we just kind of gloss over, that, it was a Samaritan, a good Samaritan who stopped and helped this injured man. But for the lawyer and for the Jewish people who heard Jesus tell this parable, when they heard that the Samaritan was the good guy, it would have come to just a screeching halt in their mind. They might have even walked away. We get a hint of this tension, that this story might not have been received very well when Jesus finishes the story, and then he turns to the lawyer and says, okay, so who was the neighbor? The lawyer, he can't even bring himself to say the word Samaritan. I just picture him standing there after Jesus has asked him this question. His teeth are gritted, and he simply says, the one who showed mercy. He can't even say Samaritan. He can't even say Samaritan. As I said, Jesus told this story to a Jewish lawyer, to a Jewish group of people, and Jews and Samaritans had an embittered history. They hated each other and they avoided each other at all costs. Now, we've often wondered, well, what is it that led to this big hatred between Jews and Samaritans? Well, one commentator put it really succinctly that they disagreed about everything that mattered. How to honor God, how to interpret the scriptures, and where to worship. Because of these disagreements, they avoided each other at all costs. Now, to the Jewish person, the Samaritan was not just another person. To the Jewish person, the Samaritan was the object of their fear, their condescension, their disgust, their judgment. To the Jewish person, the Samaritan was the other. the other, that person who is outside of their kind, outside of their comfort zone, outside of their concern. If Jesus wanted to just tell a simple moral story, if he wanted to tell a story that would leave people with the simple message, help hurting people, he could have told the story so much differently. If that's all he wanted us to get out of it, he didn't have to give identities to 3 of the 4 characters. He didn't have to say it was a priest and a Levite who walked on by. He certainly didn't have to say that it was a Samaritan who stopped and reached out and tended to the man. He could have just left them as unnamed persons. A first person walked by, then a second person walked by, then a third person came and helped them. Now go and do likewise. Help people who were injured. But Jesus gave identities to these characters, challenging identities to these men. Therefore, in this parable, Jesus is challenging us to more than just being nice, more than simply taking care of someone who is hurt. Turns out this is more than a simple moral story. Martin Luther King Jr., he used to preach on this story a lot as he was helping to lead the civil rights movement. He even preached on it the night before he was assassinated in Memphis, Tennessee. And that night, when he preached on this story, he did something powerful. He began to ponder what would lead the 2 men, the priest and the Levite, what would lead them to step to the other side of the road and keep going. He set forth some thoughts on, maybe why, perhaps, they didn't stop and help the man. He wondered, he thought perhaps the priest and the Levite, these good religious men, perhaps they were hurrying on their way to a meeting of the Jericho Improvement Association, where they were going to this meeting to address the systemic dangers of the Jericho Road and how to make the Jericho Road safer for all who traveled. Perhaps that's why they didn't stop and help the man. And then he said, or perhaps being good religious men, they kept going because the man in the ditch was bleeding, was near death. They could risk being contaminated themselves and being viewed as unclean if they came into contact with this man's body. And if they were then contaminated, they wouldn't be able to be as busy with the important work of their ministry. So maybe they passed on by because they were concerned about how it could affect their ministry or how it could, create some barriers for them or that it could get on their reputation. Perhaps it could soil their reputation, so they kept going. The third proposal that King put forth, and I think the proposal that gets to the heart of it, is perhaps they were just afraid. Afraid because the road to Jericho was a rough road. The road to Jericho was not a safe road. When Jesus said that a man was traveling down this road and he was robbed and beaten, this would not have been surprising to anybody who heard it. They would have thought, well, he should have known, being on the road to Jericho by himself. Everyone knows you don't go through that neighborhood. Maybe they were just afraid. Because you know what happens in that neighborhood? If you stop to help someone, you become the next victim. Perhaps they were afraid because if they stopped, the same person who robbed and beat the man in the ditch would come after them. Perhaps they were just afraid of stopping in the middle of the bad neighborhood. They didn't want to end up in the ditch beside the man. King said, even honorable people sometimes ask, what will happen to me if I stop? what will happen to me if I stop? Now we can see how this command to go and do likewise becomes more than just go and be nice, go and help someone who is hurting. This command reveals itself to be a much greater challenge, because this command reveals itself to be a challenge to our fears. It's a challenge to see people differently. It's a challenge that invites us to consider, who is the other to me? For the Jewish people, it was the Samaritan. They were the other, the ones whom you would avoid at all costs. They were the ones you feared. They were the ones that you would never expect to do anything good. They were the ones that if they got hurt, it's their own fault. They were the ones that if some ill luck fell on them, well, they got what was coming to them. They were the ones who were the other. The ones the Jews would avoid at all cost, whether that be for fear of safety, fear of reputation, fear of being tainted. This story invites us to consider who is the other to us. Who are the people we want to completely avoid? Who are the people we want to keep at the bottom of society? Who are the people that we would be surprised to hear did anything good? Who are the people that if we found they were in trouble would think, they got what they deserved? Who is the other? Who is it that we fear? And Jesus is challenging us to go towards them. Jesus is challenging that fear, bringing it out of the shadows and into the light of day. Now maybe you're thinking that's just too much for Jesus to ask. After all, we fear these people for good reasons. Perhaps you're thinking this is an impossible command for Jesus to give. And I would tend to agree. It does seem impossible. It's not in our human nature. It's not in our human nature to go toward the other. Remember, our human nature is to fear. Our nature is to fear because fear is our brain's way of protecting us. But just as we talked about last week, you give fear an inch and it takes over. It's unnatural. If fear is natural, then it's unnatural to see the person who is not like us, to see the person who looks differently than us, perhaps because of the color of their skin, perhaps because of their religious attire, perhaps because of their values or their beliefs. It's unnatural for us to see the other as sister, to see the other as brother, to see the other as one who is created as well as we are, as well as I am, in the image of God. Jesus, we might say, you are inviting us to do something that is impossible. It's unnatural. Therefore, Jesus, if you're inviting us, if you're challenging us, if you're commanding us to do this, then we must have your help. We must have your example. Jesus engaged in ministry and in relationships with people who were not like him all the time. He entered into relationships with people who were outside of the approved categories, outside of the approved list. He touched and transformed people whom society had deemed unclean, unworthy. He gathered the ostracized into his presence. He even gathered them around tables to share meals with him. The ostracized, like the tax collectors and the sinners, all of those whom society had said were the other. Now, if we follow his command, and if we follow in his footsteps, and if we follow in the model that he set for us, following this example, it's going to take more than just a change of mind. It's going to require a change of heart. That's what this parable is inviting. A change of heart and a change in the way that we will view those who are different from us. How we will view the other. So what will we do? What will we do in those moments where we are challenged to step toward the other? Step toward the person, the people whom we fear. I said one of the reasons I don't like that question, what will I do, is because I don't know what I will do until I'm placed in that moment. I know how I hope I would respond in any given situation, but until I reach that big moment, especially a moment as big as a Good Samaritan moment where the stakes are life and death and reaching out towards the other, I just don't know what I will do. When we may not know what we will do in those big moments, in those big challenges, the challenges where we have to overcome much fear, we can start practicing in smaller moments, in smaller encounters. We can start with the small moments and opportunities that we have when we encounter the other, when we encounter someone who is very different from us. When we encounter even the ones whom we fear, when we encounter those who are different from us, whose skin color, whose religion, whose views, whose political affiliation, whose socioeconomic standing, whose neighborhood, whose family is different. We have these opportunities, these small moments all the time where we encounter those who are the other, who are different than us. When we have the opportunity in those small moments to train our hearts, to train our hearts to be stronger than our minds, to train our hearts to be stronger than that natural fear, to have our hearts train our minds to work that muscle of love, to train our minds to react out of love instead of fear, to respond out of love instead of fear. So will we ourselves be led by love in our relationship and in our encounters with others, including the other? Or will we be led by fear? Will we lead with love when we find ourselves in a conversation with someone of a different political affiliation? Will we find ourselves leading with love when we find ourselves in a moment where we are around someone who comes from a different neighborhood, maybe even a neighborhood we're afraid of? We find ourselves in an encounter with someone who comes from a different socioeconomic status. Will we lead with love instead of fear when we're in the parking lot, on the sidewalk, and we pass someone who is different from us? Someone who looks different, someone who dresses different, someone who seems to be affirming very different values than ours. Will we look to that person and cross safely to the other side? Or will we take this as an opportunity to lead with love instead of fear? Will we be led by fear in our relationships with others? Or will we be led by love? Jesus commands us to be led by love. And I know this is no tiny command, but there's a lot at stake. There's a lot at stake because remember how this whole conversation got started? The lawyer asked Jesus, "What must I do to inherit eternal life?" It's a lot. About what's at stake, Bishop Will Willimon wrote, "Our problem is that we fear the other more than we fear the God who commands us to love each other." We fear the other more than we fear the one who commands us to love each other. He continued and challenges that we ought to fear displeasing God more than we fear the criticisms of others. I would go on, in light of the story of the Good Samaritan, we ought to fear displeasing God more than we fear our lives, more than we fear how unclean the other may make us, more than we fear the dashing of our reputation, more than we fear missing that important thing that we were on our way to do. May we see these moments, the moments that we have the encounters with the other, may we see those as moments that are presented to us by God. May we meet the challenge. May we go and do likewise. Amen.